The forest was closing in. By the dawn of the 2nd of October, 1918, the Argonne had become a cage, a twisting tangle of oaks, thorns, and fog, thick as breath. Rain dripped from the branches, and the mud beneath the soldiers' boots sucked at their soles like quicksand. The men of the 77th Division, the Statue of Liberty Division, were advancing into hell, and most of them didn't know it yet. Major Charles Whittlesey walked at the head of his column, shoulders hunched beneath his pack. A Harvard-educated lawyer in civilian life, he had the calm of a man who believed in rules, in structure, a belief that had survived everything except this forest. Ahead lay Hill 213, an unremarkable rise of ground on the map, but one that would become synonymous with endurance and isolation. Whittlesey had received the orders the previous night. The division was to advance through the Argonne as part of General Pershing's Meuse-Argonne offensive, the final great push of the war. The Germans were breaking, or so the brass said. The mission was simple: move forward, seize the Charlevoix ravine, link up with units on both flanks, and hold. It sounded straightforward on paper, but the Argonne was a maze, and in the chaos of battle, paper didn't matter. Behind Whittlesey trudged Private Abraham Krotoszyński, 22 years old, a Polish Jewish immigrant who had come to New York with nothing but his mother's prayers and a tailor's calloused hands. He spoke English with a rough accent, but his courage needed no translation. Like most of the 77th, he was from New York's Lower East Side immigrants, factory workers, sons of grocers, and longshoremen. They joked that the Germans didn't stand a chance. They never met a Bronx boy in the woods. But beneath the humor was exhaustion. They had been fighting for weeks, living on tinned meat and coffee thick as tar. As dawn broke through the trees, a low whistle cut through the mist, the signal to advance. Rifle bolts clicked. Men checked their bayonets, adjusted helmets. Whittlesey raised his hand, then dropped it. They moved. The forest swallowed them whole. Visibility shrank to 30 yards. The undergrowth clawed at their uniforms. Machine gun fire rattled from unseen positions, snapping branches overhead. Somewhere to their right, another unit moved, or was supposed to. To their left, silence. The air stank of cordite and decay. By noon, they had crossed the first ridge and reached the ravine. Whittlesey paused to study his map, his compass trembling slightly in his gloved hand. The coordinates were clear enough, but there was no sign of the French unit on his left, nor of the American battalion that should have been on his right. Still, the orders said advance. And so they did. That night, they dug in on the slope north of the Charlevoix brook. The rain returned, steady and cold. Krotoszyński crouched in the mud beside his friend, Private Lipstein, trying to light a cigarette under a helmet. "Feels like the Bronx sewer," Lipstein muttered. Krotoszyński laughed softly. "Except nobody shoots at you in the Bronx." He exhaled, watching the smoke curl upward into the dark. Above them, the trees swayed and groaned, black silhouettes against a darker sky. At headquarters, several miles behind the line, communications were already breaking down. Whittlesey's advance had outpaced neighboring units. The right flank, under Major Curtis, had been stalled by heavy machine gun fire. The French on the left were delayed. In the fog and confusion, Whittlesey's men were pressing straight into a narrowing pocket, and by the morning of the 3rd of October, they were surrounded. The Germans struck first at dawn. Mortar shells shrieked through the canopy, exploding in showers of mud and splinters. Tree trunks splintered, branches fell like knives. The Americans ducked instinctively, pressing against the wet earth. Whittlesey barked orders, his voice steady even as the ground trembled. He could see the outlines of German troops moving through the mist on both sides, tightening the noose. By mid-morning, the truth was clear. There would be no link-up. The 77th Division's Lost Battalion, about 550 men from the 308th Infantry, 306th Machine Gun, and 307th, was cut off in a ravine a half-mile long and 200 yards wide. No food, no water except what pooled in shell holes, no clear line of retreat. The radio was gone, smashed by shellfire. They were alone. Whittlesey's men dug in deeper, scraping with helmets, bayonets, bare hands. They strung barbed wire around the perimeter, posted sentries, and waited. German machine guns raked the slopes above them. Snipers fired from trees. Every movement drew fire. Whittlesey paced the line, speaking softly to his men, reminding them they were not lost, just temporarily cut off. But the word had already stuck. On the second night, the rain turned to sleet. The temperature dropped. Wounded men shivered in shallow holes, teeth chattering. Rations were gone. They gnawed at raw turnips and chewed leather straps to keep their mouths wet. Corpses began to stiffen in the mud, frozen in whatever pose death had caught them in. A private tried to crawl back toward friendly lines, but was cut down halfway. Another whispered prayers in Yiddish until his voice faded. Krotoshinsky volunteered to scout forward, crawling through the underbrush to find a gap in the line. He moved silently, mud coating his face. Every few feet, he froze, listening to the faint clink of German bayonets ahead. He saw them clearly now, rows of helmets moving between trees. Methodical, patient, they were setting up for the kill. He returned to Whittlesey, breathless, mud dripping from his uniform. "They've got us boxed in," he said. Whittlesey nodded grimly. "Then we dig deeper." By the morning of the 4th, morale had begun to waver. Some men cursed the high command. Others whispered that help would come. Whittlesey gathered the survivors under a shattered tree and spoke quietly, his voice measured and cold. "No surrender. We hold until relieved." There was no speech, no rallying cry, just the quiet authority of a man who refused to break. When the German commander sent a note through a captured American, a formal offer to surrender, Whittlesey barely looked at it before replying. "Go to hell." The German artillery began again. Shells fell with the precision of a clock. The ravine filled with smoke and debris. Men huddled under blankets, their ears ringing. A runner tried to get a message out. He was never seen again. They had one remaining messenger, a small pigeon named Cher Ami. The bird had already carried several messages through the lines. Whittlesey wrote the next one himself, in pencil, on a scrap of paper. "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The pigeon rose into the smoke, wings beating against the shrapnel-torn air. German rifles cracked. The bird staggered, dropped, then rose again, one wing shattered, one eye gone, and disappeared into the sky. Hours later, the shelling stopped. Whittlesey exhaled for the first time in days. Somewhere, someone had heard them, but relief was still miles away. For now, they were still the Lost Battalion, a handful of men in a forest that had swallowed armies. Night fell once more, bringing the same rain, the same silence, the same question none dared ask aloud. Would anyone come for them? By the morning of the 5th of October, 1918, the ravine was a grave. The men lay motionless in their muddy foxholes, staring at the treetops where the sky should have been. Food was gone. A few had resorted to stripping bark from branches, boiling it in their helmets with muddy water. The stench of decay hung over the position, sweet, metallic, unbearable. Whittlesey moved through it all in silence, his uniform stiff with dried mud, his eyes hollow. He was not a man who shouted. He simply endured. And in his endurance, the men found their last measure of discipline. The German lines were so close that the Americans could hear them talking laughter, shouts, even the scrape of boots on rock. A few of the Germans called out in English, promising food and safety if they surrendered. Whittlesey's men ignored them. No one spoke of surrender again. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky sat with his back against a shattered log, clutching his rifle. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His fingers were raw, his lips cracked from thirst. He thought of his mother in New York, lighting candles on Friday night. He had written to her once, promising he'd come home soon. Now, with every hour, he wondered if she would ever know where he fell. At midday, the shelling resumed. The Germans had the range perfectly now. Every explosion shook the ground. Branches rained down. Men ducked instinctively, but nowhere was safe. A medic shouted for help. A shell took him before the words finished leaving his mouth. The wounded cried for water. There was none. Whittlesey crouched beneath a ledge, writing another message for division headquarters. The handwriting was jagged, the letters smeared by rain. He gave it to a runner. The runner made it 50 yards before collapsing, blood seeping through his greatcoat. Whittlesey didn't flinch. He simply took out his pencil and began writing again. That afternoon, the Germans tried a new tactic: loudspeakers. A voice echoed through the trees, calm and persuasive. Americans, you are surrounded. Your situation is hopeless. If you surrender, you will be treated well. Think of your families. There was a pause, and then, faintly from somewhere down the line, an American voice shouted back, "Go to hell." The men laughed weakly. Laughter in a graveyard. For the next 2 days, the siege dragged on. The dead outnumbered the living. Many had lost their weapons, their minds, or both. When a German patrol approached under a white flag, Whittlesey refused to meet them. He simply called out, "We're staying." It wasn't bravado. It was exhaustion hardened into defiance. And then, on the 7th of October, something changed. In the early afternoon, gunfire echoed from the north, heavier, closer. It wasn't German fire. It was the crackle of Springfield rifles and the rhythmic thud of American mortars. Relief troops from the 308th sister battalions were breaking through. The trapped men could hardly believe it. Some cried, some just stared blankly. By dusk, the first scouts reached the ravine. They found what one officer later called a vision of purgatory. Of the original 550 men, fewer than 200 could still stand. 197 were dead. 150 were missing or captured. The rest wounded, delirious, skeletal, blinked in disbelief at the rescuers, as if waking from a nightmare. Major Whittlesey refused evacuation until every wounded man had been carried out. He walked the perimeter, silent, methodical, counting the living and the dead. When he finally left the ravine, it was on his own feet. He said nothing. When the survivors reached the rear lines, they were greeted as heroes. Reporters descended on them with notebooks and cameras. The papers called them the Lost Battalion, though Whittlesey never liked the term. He knew they had never been truly lost, just abandoned by circumstance, swallowed by fog and miscommunication. Still, the name stuck. In New York, crowds gathered in Union Square when the story broke. Headlines praised their courage. Heroes hold out against the Hun. Cher Ami, the pigeon, was awarded the Croix de Guerre for her message that had stopped friendly artillery from killing them all. She survived her wounds and became a national symbol, eventually stuffed and displayed in the Smithsonian. Protoshinsky received the Distinguished Service Cross and the French Croix de Guerre for helping lead the relief forces back to the position. When asked later how he did it, he simply said, "I just kept walking." For him, it was never heroism, only survival. Whittlesey was promoted to lieutenant colonel and sent home to parades, speeches, and endless interviews. He accepted every medal with quiet politeness, but his eyes stayed distant. The public saw him as a stoic hero. Those who knew him saw something else, a man who could not stop hearing the screams in the forest. He returned to his law practice in New York, but he was not the same. Friends noticed he had developed the habit of pausing mid-sentence, as though listening to something only he could hear. He avoided social gatherings, preferring to work late in his office. When reporters approached, he would smile faintly and say, "I have nothing more to add." 3 years later, on the 26th of November, 1921, Whittlesey boarded a steamer bound for Havana. He told no one where he was going. On the second night at sea, he walked quietly onto the deck, leaned over the rail, and stepped into the dark water. They found his coat folded neatly on a chair, his cabin untouched. He left no note, only silence. In the years since, historians have called his act many things: exhaustion, trauma, survivor's guilt. But perhaps it was simply the final echo of the Argonne, the one battle he couldn't leave behind. Lost Battalion became legend, a parable of endurance in the final days of a war already spent. Their stand lasted 6 days, and in those 6 days they held back multiple German assaults, survived friendly fire, and refused to yield when surrender would have been mercy. They were ordinary men, not warriors by nature, sons of immigrants, factory workers, lawyers, clerks, yet they fought like an army distilled into a single stubborn heartbeat. After the war, the ravine at Charlevaux was reclaimed by trees, the trenches filled with rain and leaves. A monument was raised there, small and weathered, engraved with the names of those who never came out. In autumn, when the fog returns, locals say the forest still feels heavy, as if memory itself has weight. Every war has its myths. The Angel of Mons, the Christmas truce. But the Lost Battalion was not myth. It was men cold, hungry, defiant, holding their ground against the dark. And when the guns finally stopped, their story became something rarer than victory. It became proof that courage can survive even when reason does not.